It's our third and final day in the beautiful Davenport, Iowa. I've been having a really great time here. How about you?
I love Davenport. I want to spend a whole bunch more time here.
When we don't have to work.
It's been awesome, though. The people have been amazing. It's been a really good time. So it's exciting that we're going to conclude the day with a few really, really high-end interviews.
Yeah, there's some great surprises coming up, things we might not have announced yet, but it's happening. We are kicking things off, though, with a pre-recorded interview with our fantastic friend, Marc Bernardin. Do you want to give a real quickie what Marc's all about?
Well, actually, I do that in the video. But
all right, well,
what I do want to tell you guys
still
about
on the first
is
coffee.
what I do want to tell you guys is we pre-recorded it, and there was just a little bit of banter at the front and back of it. And I was like, I should cut that, but then we thought it was like
I love all your precipices to these
funny.
Interviews. By the way, we didn't capture the video. That was yesterday. We have the video and audio today.
Yeah, this one's good. There's honestly, it's just this little bit of banter I thought was super funny. And I know you thought it was super funny.
Of course, because that's how we roll with Marc Bernardin. Anyways, press play.
Don't be alarmed if my dog is licking his balls in the back, because he's in here and he's.
I would expect nothing less. I bet you that's just a requirement of people walking in that room.
Right? Yeah.
All right.
Everybody's got to have a good ball lick. Okay.
2 minutes here and we're already ball licking,
Okay, cool. Okay, here we go. Hey guys, we're back at the Stephen King Rules Film Festival. I am Norm Coyne. Joining me is my co-host Leah Coghlan. Say hi, Leah.
Hello.
And we are very lucky to have a special guest today, Mr. Marc Bernardin. For those of you who maybe don't know, Marc Bernardin is a Writers Guild Award-winning screenwriter who worked on Castle Rock. He's been working on Star Trek Picard, Carnival Row, Treadstone, Masters of the Universe, Revelations. I'm sure he's got a whole slew of projects that he can't even talk about. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Marc Bernardin.
Hi, Norm. Hi, Leah.
Hi, Marc.
How are you?
We're so happy you're here today.
Oh, yay.
Awesome. For those of you that maybe don't know, we have a convention called Northern Fan Con, of which Marc is a legacy guest. So that's how we know this handsome fella. And he's always up there doing these crazy screenwriting workshops. And so we harassed him to come out and be part of the Stephen King Rules Film Festival.
I'm bringing all of the energy that I bring to a Sunday of Northern Fan Con. Which is mostly awake, mostly legible, and understandable. But
excellent. Yeah, slightly hungover, maybe.
Let's do it.
Right on. Okay, well, let's just jump right into it, because I know that you're a busy guy. You got only a little bit of time for us. But for any of our guests that are zooming in, joining us, whichever, we of course are asking about their Stephen King origin story. So what was your first introduction to Stephen King, Marc?
Well, Norm, I will tell you, I am a bit of a fraidy cat, wuss, a lily-livered weakling, in that I am not the biggest horror person. And so my first entree to Stephen King was not The Shining or It or The Stand or Carrie or Cujo. It was Eyes of the Dragon. It was the fantasy novel he wrote. I think the lore behind it is he wrote it for one of his sons who liked fantasy stuff. And it's Dad, how come you never write fantasies? Yeah, you want fantasy? And then a weekend later is Eyes of the Dragon, because that's how Stephen King writes. I made all that up. Probably not true. But nevertheless, it was, wizards and dragons and knights and swords and fantasy. And I dug it so much. So much so that I then would go back and do all of the Stephen King work that everybody else does. And by work, I mean the most fun ever. And along that process, I discovered that, yes, Stephen King is a master in horror. But the thing that he rarely gets credit for, and should, is that he is one of America's great character writers. And so going back and just watching him build the story of the lives of people who get impacted by supernatural shenanigans. Before that happens, you know who they are. You know who Danny Torrance is. You know who Carrie White is. You know who Stu Redman is. You know all of their lives before, crazy homicidal ghost-possessed dads and or supernatural telekinesis and or crazy hyperviruses crash into their lives and upend it all.
So when we ask that question to people about their origin story, it's usually like, it's about horror in general or Stephen King. They're like, I was a small child and I saw like The Shining or The Exorcist. So what is it about like us Gen X kids that like made Stephen King be like so much part of our orbit? Because you can bet your ass that kids today probably are not like that young and getting their initiation into horror.
I mean, I think the barriers between horror and our fragile little minds were much lower. When we were young, like there was always a Stephen King novel on the shelf, right? Like your parents read it and rarely policed the things that you read as long as it was on the shelf. Like he's reading. It's fine. Let the boy read. We're happy he's reading and not out there causing trouble and raising a ruckus. And similarly, all of those movies were accessible. Like even just as the video store boom happened in the 80s and cable television began to be a thing in the 90s, or also the 80s, but that feeling of we had access to it and nobody telling us we couldn't read it or watch it or listen to it. And it's Stephen King. It's good. And so of course we dug into it. And he's got enough children protagonists that like if you're a 13, 14-year-old kid, you're like, hey, I also don't understand what's happening to my body. And so I will be, like, I am a fire starter too, damn it. Why do I make everything go bad? Why do I cause all of this trouble? So it was actually like a really easy way in for a kid to find an on-ramp to Stephen King because it was everywhere.
Nice. So you got to work on Castle Rock. Obviously, yes. This is huge. Won Writers Guild Award for it. What was it like? Because obviously you're familiar with King at that point. Were you what kind of research were you doing? Like, how were you actually kind of getting into the process for writing for something kind of specific like that?
The process was, there were 7 or 8 writers on the first season of Castle Rock, and it became a bit of like Castle Rock Stephen King boot camp, where we would all choose a book to read, and we'd all go off and do our independent study and read, listen to, watch, and all that stuff, our Stephen King homework, and then bring it back to the group, and then we would all talk about, the themes that we found that resonate and harmonize amongst the Stephen King works, the things that are specific to, like my thing was Needful Things was the big book that I had to read. And then eventually I also did Green Mile. I had never read Needful Things before that particular gig, but I remember reading Green Mile in the little like tiny 80, 90 page pamphlet style novels that we would put out. So going back to that and rewatching the movie and seeing how those things differed. But the process was very much like a survey of what makes Stephen King stories work. What do they do and what don't they do? Because we were trying to write the lost Stephen King story. We weren't like a cover band just trying to pick up, say, hey man, what are we gonna do now? Let's do Shawshank. It was a matter of like, what's the lost song? What's the single that never made it onto an album? What's the book he wrote but never released? So we needed to feel like Stephen King without being a copycat of other Stephen King. So figuring out what are the building blocks of a Stephen King story? What are the things that he does that other writers don't do? How do his stories manifest? And the only way to do that was just to dive in the deep end.
So you brought up a really interesting point in regards to my next question. I loved the show. I thought it was great. They decided to cancel it after the second season because they didn't want it to be stale in case it retold already produced King adaptations. And I kind of think that's horseshit. We live in the remake and reboot era. And I want to know what you think about that, because I felt that there was so much to be told.
Yeah, I mean, there were definitely more stories, more fruit on the tree that was Castle Rock. Because the idea of a town in which bad things happen with frightening regularity seems to open a relatively clear course for more crazy things to happen to these people in this place. I mean, there are always reasons why a show get canceled that have nothing to do with creative, possibilities or potentials. There are always, and I assume that if you looked and see what happens at a place like Warner Brothers Discovery / HBO Max, this particular news cycle, stuff is getting snipped off of that tree with little regard for whether it was good or bad or indifferent. So it's always hard to tell. I will say that there were stories to be told, and I 100% plans to go deeper into certain characters, to recontextualize what it meant to be a Castle Rock story, to offer new ways of looking at what had been old Stephen King nuggets and gems. So yeah, you could remix Stephen King all day long and still find gold in them Thar Hills.
Agreed.
Awesome. So in a recent interview, actually on KingCast, who the KingCast guys are actually joining us as another of these fabulous kind of vignette interviews. You talked a bit about The Running Man and how that was a story that you really, it really spoke to you, and how you'd actually done a screenplay on The Running Man. So if this is kind of actually in the spirit of, say, Fat Man Beyond, where they have the funnest questions of all time coming from Scum and Villainy. If we were to dreamcast your version of The Running Man, who would you want to it be in the 2 lead roles, and then who would direct that? Would you direct it?
I would not direct it. Let's not get crazy. Let's not get crazy. Just because I would like to see my family at some point in the next 6 months. I think if you sign on to do something like that, then you are isolating yourself in movie world for a while. But I love The Running Man. I love it so much. And I love it precisely because I think the movie they made is awful, which I came to as a fan of Arnold Schwarzenegger. I'm like, what's Arnold doing now? The Running Man, cool. This seemed neat. And then you watch that movie. It's really silly and daffy, but there's still the idea of a world in which our fascination with misery of others has exploded and mated with the desire for reality television, which I think it's a 1986 novella. There's no way it could have been as prescient as it is, except that it totally 100% is. And then watching shows like today, like Squid Game, or even Black Mirror, which have absolutely tapped into that desire and appetite of on the part of the average person to watch carnage happen to the less fortunate. I still think there's a lot to be said there, and I'm a little chafed that Edgar Wright is making a movie, but that's neither here nor there. If I were going to fan cast the 2 roles of Ben Richards and Damon Killian, I think Aldous Hodge would be great as Ben Richards. Aldous Hodge, who was in Leverage, who's currently on City on the Hill, and who's about to be Hawkman in Black Adam. I think there's something incredibly empathetic about him. There's something incredibly physical about him. And so watching a dude like that at the end of his rope, I think would be really interesting and lots of fun. As for Damon Killian, I mean, they Richard Dawson was their Damon Killian in that 1980s movie, which was perfect because it's a game show host, and so who are you going to get but the greatest game show host that has ever been? I think that there's a version of, and if you could pretend as if there is no questionable mystery hanging about this particular actor for reasons that seem to have been out of his control. But I think Alec Baldwin would be really interesting.
Ooh, yeah,
great ball, man.
I think that there's a flintiness to him. There's a desire to please an audience about him. But once that camera's off of that guy, I believe 100% that he can be venal and angry and merciless, while then being able to, on the drop of a dime, just turn on the smile and the charm and be, your nation's favorite television host. So yeah, that's I think not to cast aspersions to Alec Baldwin's actual persona, but I believe that he can conjure that stuff on screen. As for who makes that movie, or TV miniseries or whatever it is, I'm not sure. I might have said Edgar Wright, but screw that dude. Screw that dude. It's interesting. There's parts of me that think that somebody like Paul Verhoeven would be really good at that.
Yeah.
Like, who has the outsider's perspective on American culture that helps to amplify and inform movies like RoboCop and Total Recall and Starship Troopers, but also understands what makes your average person tick, and is very, very good with action and violence and gore and tension. And I think it's a tense piece. And I think you want somebody who knows how to make that work.
Sold.
Leah,
write him a check.
Write him a check. They're a standard rich and famous contract.
I love that you love The Running Man, and I love that whole interview with the King cast. Has Stephen King ever directly influenced you anywhere else in anything that you might have done?
Direct influences, I'm not sure. Other than people occasionally ask me, it's like, hey, if I had to read a book about screenwriting, do you have any favorites that you would recommend that I read? And the first one I was mentioned is Writing by Stephen King. Not that it's specifically about screenwriting, but it's about writing. It's about how he goes about doing it. It's the tools that he puts in his toolbox, as he says, that lets him tell stories, as well as being like a pretty riveting memoir of the time he got hit by a van once and almost died, and his sort of path to recovery, and how ultimately writing was the thing that helped pull him out of what could have been an incredibly precarious, both personal and medical crisis. But so reading that book and feeling, his sort of guiding hand on your shoulder as you go about trying to be a better writer and trying to learn how to make use of the tools that we all sort of share, has been really sort of crucial over time. And it's only one of 3 books I ever recommend to people, because there's like 500 books about screenwriting out there, and most of them don't help. If you read enough of them, they're all saying the same thing. But Stephen King's is a bit of a Bible for me.
Nice.
That's cool.
Okay, switching gears a little. What do you think is the most terrifying Stephen King book or film? Like, what scared the shit out of you? I know you're a scaredy cat. You're a self-proclaimed scaredy cat. But like, what is it? Or I mean, even it doesn't have to be the entire thing, but I mean something that just like scared the shit out of you.
I have the most vivid memory of reading The Stand while on a subway commuting in New York City and encountering the chapter that is just about the spread of Captain Trips, right? Like how it just kind of trips through, literally, the human populace in the smallest ways and the biggest ways. And I think this chapter is like 4 pages long. 4 paragraphs long. And it's just of a guy sitting on a subway, and on the other end of the subway car, somebody coughs. And so I'm on the subway reading this book, and just suddenly like looking around, and like, one of these sons of bitches have a virus. And because I'm a New Yorker, because I spent, the first 25 years of my life living in New York and traveling those trains and that system and driving in and out of the Holland Tunnel and the Lincoln Tunnel, the fact that so much of that book, especially the front end of the horror of that book, takes place in some place that I was intimately familiar with. And so there's a chapter when you have to leave Manhattan, and the only way to get out of there is through the Lincoln Tunnel, and all the lights are off. And that's horrifying to me, because I've been through that tunnel 1,000 times, and I know exactly what that would feel like if the lights went out, and to be trapped under there. Like, it's when he takes the everyday, the mundane, the things that we are all intimately familiar with, and makes them horrifying, that for me is the most effective version of Stephen King horror. That's just my personal read, but I also have nightmares about like being trapped in a car and evil demon dog being trying to get in, because I've been in my car before and I've seen awful dogs before. I'm like, oh yeah, no, this is horrifying. Thanks, Uncle Steve.
Uncle Steve. I like how you said I was sitting there on a subway and then I'm looking around. I've had that moment with Stephen King. Like during a power outage once, I thought it'd be a really great idea to keep reading it. And like that Pennywise just scares the fuck out of me. And like there was a noise in the book and I really I stopped too and I looked around and I was like, oh my God. So it's cool to know that those moments happen for other people.
100%.
You were recently nominated for an Eisner Award for your graphic novel, Adora and the Distance. So, yes. What do you think would be a good Stephen King story to make a great comic out of?
Wow. Okay. Well, there's been Dark Tower comics that were actually very good. Marvel put those out about a decade or so ago. I'm going to go back to my original cut. I'm going to go back to Eyes of the Dragon. I think that actually lends itself very well to a graphic adaptation. It's queens and princesses and dragons and wizards and castles and moats and all of that stuff. Like, it's incredibly visual. It's incredibly lush in that way. I think that a lot of the smaller Stephen King works, they not that they couldn't be comics. Anything could be a comic, but it becomes more intimate of a comic. It becomes, Needful Things might be interesting, but it's a small story about a town that slowly gets upended by a traveling salesman with a cabinet of curiosities. The Shining might be interesting, like seeing what the Overlook feels like. If it doesn't have to be a literal place that you have to build and shoot, like what does that hotel, how does that get to sprawl? How does the hedge maze and the topiary get to just be this enormous, just swarming entity of, brush and pine and leaves and thorns? Like there's a lot of visual density to that particular book that I think could translate really well to a comic book page.
Has anybody ever tried to adapt Eyes of the Dragon, like to a film?
I have a feeling that the rights at some point got bought or options, as every Stephen King thing under the face of the sun has ever been, has had its shot. But I don't think everybody's ever done it. I want to say Sci-Fi optioned it at some point to do as a miniseries, and then realize we don't have that money. We're Sci-Fi.
Yeah, for sure. Okay. So having played in the King universe in Castle Rock, it's exploring characters, in that universe. What King character would you like to see kind of continue in another chapter, or not of Castle Rock, but just say, maybe it's, Andy Dufresne or someone like that, like just a single character that would continue on. Who would be somebody you'd like to see, more of the story from?
It's tempting to say Alan Pangborn, because everybody likes a test-turned sheriff, who can sort of get the job done. Is there is there a Justified show about Alan Pangborn as the poor sheriff who gets called in to deal with the craziest nonsense that comes out of, any given town? Maybe. I've always been fascinated though by Carrie White. What happens to her after Pig's Blood and burning down a gymnasium? What's the rest of her life like? Having this power and then also being afraid of this power and blaming herself for this power. Does the events of that night, of that prom night, reinforce the kind of Catholic guilt that her mother was trying her best to sort of imprison her with? And then when does it break loose again? And they've made sequels to Carrie. I don't think any of them are particularly good. I don't think they're awful either. I will just say I've never seen them, because they were not Brian De Palma, they were not that cast, they were not that story. And I think I mentioned it on the King cast that I did have a pitch for the end of the first season of Castle Rock, where Sissy Spacek was still playing Carrie White the whole time. This was her version of witness protection. And the reasons why everything was happening in that town was it was where a telekinetic, pyrokinetic, gifted individual who had dementia went to retire. And then when that much power is no longer contained or controlled, that's why bad things are happening in this town. That the pitch was met with, I love it, we can't do it. And so we didn't do it because we didn't have the rights to carry White. But I do think that particular character and following that story might be fascinating.
Sold. Leah, get him another check.
Oh, somebody checks.
Oh, right on that. Yeah.
You should have told me when we started this was going to be a check given.
Hey, this isn't just a thing for your friends sometimes. My last question: why do you think King has remained relevant in our lifetime?
Because I think the thing that he does and does so well is he manages to tap into and conjure for us our greatest fears, right? Like there's, and not to slide into another author's work on a podcast at a festival that's devoted to Stephen King, but there's a character in The Sandman named the Corinthian who is was designed to be a nightmare, and the purpose of a nightmare is not just to frighten you, but it's to reflect upon humanity, the things that make us all human, because we're all afraid of things. And so if we can conjure those fears and those nightmares, then we can connect and bond with our fellow humans. And so the thing that Stephen King does so well is he reaches into our subconscious and gives us our nightmares on the page. And then the reason why those books are so popular is because those nightmares happen to be universal. We're all afraid of the thing that goes bump in the dark. We're all afraid of ourselves at some point. We're all afraid that we are not who we think we can be. You know, we're all afraid, or there's Stephen King's afraid of fans. And so, or of the person who loves us too much. I think there's always some level of human reality and a deep understanding of the human psyche within all of Stephen King's works, even the minor ones, even the ones that aren't entirely successful, but they all tap into that thing that bonds us all together.
Man, it must just hurt to be so intelligent and insightful. I'm like, you're so great, man. Okay, so my final question.
Yes.
What's a secret you've never told anybody? No, that's not it. Just like, what are you working on right now? That's like, we'll close it out by allowing you to have a little plug to all our hundreds of people watching. No.
To all of the hundreds in the studio and the thousands at home. I'm trying to think what I am working on that I can talk about. I can say that I am beginning to think about another short film after having, just about put the finishing touches on the last one I did, Splinter, which we're very, very close to being done with. We have like all the VFX, the score is in hand. We just have to do the final sound mix and color timing on the picture. And then we see what happens to it after the afterbirth of that particular short. And I wrote an episode of a cartoon that hopefully will be coming out in the next couple of years, because that's how long these things take, called Batman the Caped Crusader, for Warner Brothers, which is being produced by J.J. Abrams and Matt Reeves and Bruce Timm and Ed Brubaker. And that was a riot to do. Like, I'd never written Batman before, so to get to write Batman was a blast. And then there's the standard, I've done 4 things that I can't talk about because, we're a little bit too early in those production schedules to reveal, or at the very least, it's not my place to reveal them. There's other dudes who 100% can go ahead and say whatever they want, but I'd like to keep getting paid, so I'm going to keep my mouth shut. But yeah, man, just continuing to plug away, continuing to try and make stuff up and let them pay me for it, and getting to live this ridiculous dream.
Awesome. Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to speak with us, and for all of our Stephen King fans out there. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mark.
This is fun. Bye. Hey, that dog should be licking more balls.
I know.
Mr. Poco, wake up.
Goddamn dog, always letting me down. Mark, thank you so much, buddy.
You got it, man. Like, I was promised more ball licking.